Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the mornings. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday, June 9th, 2025. Time for us all to move to Los Angeles, I guess, and get involved in the action going on out there. You know, when I left, the country was fine, and I don't know what happened. Friday night even was pleasantly chatting on social media about my experience importing meat from Iceland. That is to say, hot dogs. I don't know. Somebody started a thread on Blue Sky about the various foodstuffs that they've brought home with them from various vacations. And they all had very fancy, nice, cool stuff. Fancy cheeses, beautiful breads, etc. I brought hot dogs home. but they're Icelandic hot dogs. And anybody who's ever had them or heard about them knows that they're something special. And they're a meat product, which ordinarily you can't get through customs. And, oh, by the way, Customs and Border Patrol actually important in the news today. Now, I didn't defeat them, I guess, not soundly enough back then. But I just wanted to remind everybody who might be going to Iceland, if you experience the hot dogs and you think they're great, you can take them with you. It is okay as long as they are in the original packaging. And the packaging is clearly marked that they are country of origin is Iceland. Iceland has no cattle disease, and so ordinarily the controls that prohibit you from importing meat products from another country, yes, that means the ham you picked up in Spain, all that kind of stuff, the sausages in Italy, for the most part, not permitted to be imported for personal use in your baggage, and they have dogs that will smell that, and I don't know whether they're allowed to eat the treats, so it's really cruel to the dogs. But Icelandic hot dogs you can bring, and I heard about that, and I researched it briefly, and I think we researched it briefly on the plane, like, uh-oh, what are we going to do with these hot dogs that we bought at the airport? But we were pretty sure that you could get them through because we had learned about this cattle disease thing. We had gone horseback riding, and they were telling everybody who was horseback riding, if you've brought your own equipment, don't use it because it might have, diseases in it that you carry from outside of Iceland and give to our wonderful, very special breed Icelandic horses that are free of all of these livestock diseases. And then the flip side of it is you can take the hot dogs home. But we got there and we fully declared them and everything and got a big question mark from the customs guys. No, you can't bring meat products in. Actually, well, we will actually customs, which is not for everybody. And it was before, everything went completely crazy. But at any rate, we did do that, and we told them you gotta look it up. Meat products from Iceland are actually permitted, and maybe this was sort of a, only at Dulles do you get this sort of thing. You can't bring this into the country. Actually, I can. I work at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and, So then, though, I don't know, something happened in Los Angeles, and the whole tone shifted, although it did have something to do with customs and Border Patrol. Greg Dworkin is here. Let's bring him in the door because there's no noise from the fabulous silent entry in what are we using? The other thing. Zoom, that's it. All right. Have we tried this one before?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
That's the one that sounds like you get up at camp.
Yes, that's right. And then it kind of oddly ends and almost taps there. So that's a little bit.
Well, that's the way camp ends too. So
okay, that's true too. Oh, so the full camp day is there. All right, I need to find a way of marking these things permanently, so that I have a new one every day. I don't know how long that'll last.
Yeah,
but okay.
Just don't play taps.
Right. Okay. Well, that's not maybe it's in here somewhere if I look far enough. Oh, spinning newspaper headline. That sounds good. Let's try that one. Oh, Batman-ish.
Hey,
nice.
we found a new favorite.
We can work on that one. Cool. Yeah. So that was the newspaper twirling, in the old.
Yeah.
Okay. So that plus
with
Batman.
The big headline. So, you can't bring horses to Iceland either. I mean, you can't not just bring horses. The equipment and the tack and the gear and the riding crop. You can't bring
leave the
horses.
riding crap at home, people. And
Only
honestly,
Icelandic ponies are allowed.
That's true. And I found out Icelandic ponies that leave the country cannot come back. They're not allowed back in. I mean, they're strict at all to save your ability to take hot dogs home.
I
like
get
a
it.
lamb.
So Trump is trying to impose Icelandic pony rules on the United States.
Yeah, and and people don't even have the benefit of the extra gate. So, yeah, that's right. And we wish you would leave as well. And we're going to chase you out of the country. Apparently, that's So Los Angeles is in regular order, largely, and then there's a couple of streets that are closed.
I'm old, which is scary because this immediately reminded me of Kent State, and obviously a bunch of other people reminded of Kent State.
Sure.
In other words, things can go wrong and things can go sour really, really fast.
Which is what Trump and Stephen Miller were reminded of Kent State. Like, yes, awesome. Let's shoot some students and weirdos and nerds.
Some things to remember about Kent State: 4 students were shot. They were shot by state guardsmen for a protest in the Nixon era.
Yes.
But the thing to remember is that these young non-college National Guardsmen in Ohio, where this happened, were basically on Nixon's side.
Yes. I guess.
And although the country was horrified by it, and the people who actually pulled the trigger were probably horrified by it, there was an uncomfortable amount of support for the Nixon side in that era when it came to National Guardsmen.
Yeah.
And that's probably not too different than today. It's true that, California leans blue. And people like the National Guard who live in that state are part of the environment that they grow up in. So if you, for example, to pick a random example, if you're in Texas or Missouri and you're talking to social workers or nurses in a very red area, in a hospital, rural hospital, if they still have one open or whatever, and you talk about their political views, chances are they're going to be staunch Republicans who voted for Trump. Yeah. Despite the fact that they're in the, quote, social services area and or some profession where you'd think there'd be some resistance to the Trump agenda. Maybe. But for the most part, 9 out of 10, if it's a 90% Trump area, are going to reflect the mores of their community. It's just the way it goes. They may be more open to discussion. They may be more open to thinking about it. But when it comes to, voting and pulling the lever, as we used to say in New York with the old machines, and you youngins don't know what I'm talking about, but it used to be a lever vote. You'd pull the lever and all of the Democrats, straight ticket voting, would click. And then when you open the curtain, they'd pop up real quick so that nobody could see how you voted. They were really kind of cool.
Not the candidates.
They were inefficient and they often got stuff wrong, so they had to replace them with modern voting equipment.
They used to have the candidates would pop up, scared the hell out of people.
Yeah, if you go to California,
let's go.
Then the National Guardsmen from California are not going to be reflective necessarily of the total vote. In other words, you can't expect that the National Guard in California is going to be 60-40 Harris voters, because they may have pulled disproportionately from the central part of California, which is very conservative, the up north part of California, which is very conservative. People who enlist in the Guard are different than people who, perhaps live in Los Angeles.
Yes. Although the great irony of them being non-college during the Kent State thing was that pretty soon thereafter, most people were joining the National Guard to get money to go to college. But that's good. But, we're in favor of that. But
yeah. The problem is if you join the National Guard, you might get sent to Vietnam. So you had to be very careful.
Yes. Well, there was that likelihood anyway. So a different atmosphere, certainly. And though people do warn every once in a while, enlisted troops are not the officer corps. They're not there for the same reasons very often. So they may be less conservative than you would ordinarily think, but you do need to be reminded they're not going to necessarily be as blue-leaning as California.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly
that's
right.
true. I
That's
got
what
your
I'm trying to
point.
say. So they may be
Well, you
less
did say it, and you
conservative
did a good job
than
of
the
it.
officer
That's where I
corps, but they're
learned
more
it.
conservative than you.
Yeah, most likely. Yeah. But on the other hand, they are Californians, and they know what it means to be sent on patrol to fight their own.
Yeah,
Or,
on this, at the other side of the coin, there is the majority of them will do what they're told.
yes. And now the question is, what are they being told? We
Well,
don't
that's
know.
where Pete Hegseth comes in. So in the beginning,
Come
when
on
it
in,
was
Pete.
clear that he was incompetent, and
Have
it's
a
clear
drink.
that his staff is incompetent, and it's clear that nobody competent wants to work with him,
Yeah.
you'd scratch your head and say, well, why is Trump keeping him? And the answer is this.
Yeah.
He doesn't want competent people. He wants brown shirts and fascists.
Yeah. He's going
And
to
he
repeat
wants
what I
people,
said.
he wants people who are going to do what he's told. Well, so what Trump tells them, what they're supposed to do what they're told. That being the case, it's probably not the case that we're talking about armed takeover of the United States via the military at this point. But what is very likely the case is that this is sort of a test case to see how far Trump can go, to see how the military responds to being sent to stop a fake insurrection, a Reichstag fire situation. This is obviously something that Trump is trying to escalate. His side is passing around pictures of cars burning from 5 years ago. Even Twitter has the community notes on it saying, this is an old picture. This is not what's going on here. So that being the case, it's incumbent upon demonstrators to continue to demonstrate, but to do it nonviolently. As one of my good friends on Twitter, very smart centrist voter, black voter, who says, look, it's obvious who wins the Democratic nomination. It's whoever black women want. Also said, the thing about Martin Luther King is that he totally understood that it was incumbent upon demonstrators in that kind of environment, 63, 64, 62, to control your march.
Yes.
Do not give provocation to the people who were looking for it. The reason that Bloody Sunday was so remarkable, the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge that got John Lewis's head beat in, is there was no provocation. That was simply the police willing and looking for an excuse to beat heads. And you don't want to give any kind of provocation to that. So the people in LA, in that sense, are in a difficult situation. You have to protest, but you have to be really, really careful about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's true. And in an atmosphere where provocation will be found in anything or even manufactured if necessary, given that they're sending around fake pictures or pictures from protests or riots from earlier years. By the way, I sent around a picture of January 6th because Ted Cruz was complaining about this along with somebody. I don't remember what other lunatic was agreeing. Oh my God, this is what Los Angeles looks like right now. I just started sending pictures of January 6th saying, this is Ted Cruz going to vote in Congress right now. This is outrageous. He says it's just peaceful voting. Is this from a different time? I didn't know that. Sorry, I got that.
That's him going to Cancun. Yeah. So this piece is from The Conversation. From Kent State to Los Angeles, using armed forces to police civilians is a high-risk strategy. Responding to street protests in L.A. And by the way, it has a nice summary in it of what happened in Kent State for those of you who don't know or don't remember.
I heard the song.
Protests in L.A. against federal immigration enforcement raids. Donald Trump ordered 2,000 soldiers from the California National Guard into the city to protect agents carrying out the raids. Trump also authorized the Pentagon to dispatch regular U.S. troops as necessary. That is to say, send in the Marines, literally. The president's orders didn't specify rules of engagement. California Governor Gavin Newsom, who did not request the National Guard, asserted it was not needed, criticized the president's decision as inflammatory, and warned it'll only escalate things. The author of this, whose name is Brian Vandemark, is professor of history at the U.S. Naval Academy. And says, I'm a historian who's written several books about the Vietnam War. One of the most divisive episodes in our nation's past, my recent book, Kent State, An American Tragedy, examines a historic clash on May 4th, 1970, between anti-war protesters and National Guard at Kent State University in Ohio. The confrontation escalated into violence. Troops opened fire on the demonstrators, killing 4 students, wounding 9, including one who was paralyzed for life. In my view, dispatching California National Guard troops against civilian protesters chillingly echoes decisions and actions that led to the tragic Kent State shooting. Some active duty units, as well as National Guard troops, are better prepared today than in 1970, but the vast majority of their training remains to fight and kill and win wars.
Well, yeah.
So typically the Guard's been deployed to deal with natural disasters and support local police. Examples include riots in Detroit, Washington, LA, and Minneapolis in 2020 after the death of George Floyd. Presidents rarely deploy National Guard troops without state governors' consent. They do have the right to do it. They did it in the 50s and 60s during the Civil Rights Movement. The last time they did it was in the 60s for Nixon. So the 1807 Insurrection Act grants presidents authority to use active duty troops or National Guard forces to restore order within the U.S. And remember, back in the 50s and 60s with Lester Maddox and the segregation issues, you can't always count on governors to do the right thing. Therefore, the president has the right to go ahead and
well, that's an important point.
These troops in. So it's not that this is illegal. This is one of those situations where you can do it, but you shouldn't do it. There's other situations where Trump is doing stuff that he can't do, and he's doing it anyway. This is not that situation. He can do this. He just shouldn't.
Yeah, although there are some important limitations on it. So there's some great, hair splitting and weed pulling that's out there about it. But yeah, initially, can he dispatch them there? Yes. What kind of mission can he give them? That's a different question. And then what happens if he is interested in sending, as he says, the Marines there? How can they be used? Well, very differently. Because of the authority that he claimed to be invoking in order to dispatch the National Guard, he has adopted one set of limits rather than another. So there's some interesting rundowns of all of that. And a great point, as you mentioned, this has been done before, and all the people on the news, the reporters did, some homework on it and said this isn't what usually happens, particularly the foreign reporters explaining to people what's going on. This isn't the usual course of events. Can it happen? Yes. How long has it been since it happened? Many, many years. And they're mentioning the civil rights era dispatches, but someone else did point out, well, in the civil rights era, the dispatching of the National Guard was to enforce civil rights that the citizenry had as against the government, versus where now the National Guard is being dispatched to suppress rights people have as against the government. It's a backwards situation. So that's something.
Well, they would argue that it's there to protect the rights of citizens, except they mean only white citizens.
Yes. Well, that's
that's another issue here.
Mm-hmm.
This brief reminder of what happened at Kent State from this historian: the war in Vietnam had grown increasingly unpopular by the early 70s, but protests intensified on April 30th, 1970, when President Richard Nixon authorized expanding the conflict into Cambodia. At Kent State, after a noontime anti-war rally, alcohol-fueled students harassed passing motorists and smashed storefront windows. On May 2nd, anti-war protesters set fire to the building where military officers trained Kent State students enrolled in the Armed Forces ROTC program.
Yes.
You may all remember that from that era. On college campuses, it was not unusual to have college kids trained in ROTC and do maneuvers. And, the argument was, should colleges participate in this? Shouldn't we all be anti-war? On the other hand, if you get college-educated officers, you're much better off than with some of the Neanderthals that were otherwise there. So, probably remains controversial today. In response, Republican Governor Jim Rhodes, always a Republican, dispatched National Guard troops against the advice of university and many local officials who understood the mood in the town of Kent and on campus far better than Rhodes. County Prosecutor Ron Kane had vehemently warned Rhodes deploying the National Guard could spark conflict and lead to fatalities. This is the ultimate town gown confrontation, folks. Nonetheless, Rhodes, who was trailing in an impending Republican primary for U.S. Senate seat, struck the pose of take charge leader who wasn't going to be pushed around by long-haired rabble. We're going to put a stop to this. Does this sound familiar? Hundreds
Yeah.
of National Guard troops were deployed across town and on campus. Further rallies were banned, but 2,000 to 3,000 students gathered anyway. They were met by 96 National Guardsmen led by 8 officers, poorly trained. They weren't trained to handle crowds or riot control at all.
Mm-hmm.
Confrontation, as student anger over Nixon's expansion of the war blended with resentment over the Guard's presence. Protesters chanted anti-war slogans, shouted epithets, made obscene gestures. They were not in Martin Luther King controlled, shall we say. The guardsmen sent to Kent State had no training in de-escalation. Their commanding officer decided to use them to break up what the Department of Justice later deemed a legal assembly. In my view, it was the historian. It was a reckless judgment that inflamed an already volatile situation. Students started showering the greatly outnumbered guardsmen with rocks and other objects in violation of Ohio Army National Guard regulations.
They
didn't warn the students he had ordered guardsmen's rifles loaded with live ammunition.
Yeah.
The officer failed to adequately supervise his increasingly fearful troops, and the platoon sergeant yelled fire in the air in a desperate attempt to prevent bloodshed. But some guardsmen wearing gas masks made it hard to hear, just said fire, and they
I heard
shot
that part. Yeah.
And killed him. No warning shots, just shot at him.
Yeah. Sort of Boston Massacre style.
Many National Guardsmen who were at Kent State later questioned why they had been deployed there. Loaded rifles and fixed bayonets are pretty harsh solutions for students. Why would you put soldiers trained to kill on a university campus to serve a police function? That's all relevant to today. The National Guard is much better trained. They do have some de-escalation training. They do have some riot control training.
Yeah.
I would normally, in a normal situation, which Trump era is not, say, and they're not going to have live bullets, but God knows.
Yeah. Well,
it's Pete Hegseth we're talking about.
Right, true. Right. Who knows whether maybe he had a little something to drink because he was passing out the bullets. It wasn't him.
Well, even if he didn't, his deputies are all incompetent. Nobody knows.
And I've certainly read plenty of gun fail stories, but I thought they were blanks or, all sorts of things can happen.
Sure.
And, well, okay, they probably are a little bit better trained. They probably do know something of, if they don't specifically know Kent State, they know the idea. We're going to be in a delicate situation, and we got to be careful because things can go crazy, and we can make them go crazy. Other people can too, but chiefly us.
Question on the table is whether or not they actively wanted to go crazy. So here's a piece by Tom Nichols in The Atlantic. Trump is using the National Guard as bait. Don't give him the pretext he wants.
Well, all right.
I mean, that headline says it all. I thought the other article was well worth summarizing in depth because, again, Kent State, you're going to hear lots of references to Kent State. Look it up for yourself. It was an important event. And yes, this absolutely positively brings up the ghost of Kent State.
Yeah, sure. Even if they're not students.
Even if they're not students.
Okay. But if they should all carry backpacks and books.
So Tom Nichols says the president and the men and women around him are acting with great ambition in this moment. They're likely hoping to achieve 3 goals in one dramatic action. First, they'll turn America's attention away from Trump's many failures in inane feuds and reestablish his campaign persona as a strong man who'll brush aside the law if that's what it takes. Perhaps nothing would please Trump more than to replace weird stories about Elon Musk with video of mass protesters burning cars. That's why they're showing 3-year-old pictures of burning cars.
Yes.
Second, as my colleague David Frum warned this morning, Trump is establishing he's willing to use the military any way he pleases, perhaps as proof of concept for free elections in 2026. Trump sees the U.S. military as his personal honor guard and his private muscle. They're his toy soldiers, and he's going to get a show from his honor guard in a birthday parade next weekend.
Yeah. Maybe.
Okay. Third, Trump may be hoping to radicalize the citizen soldiers drawn from the community who serve in the National Guard. This touches on the point I made about where they're from.
Yeah.
Seizing the California Guard is also a convenient way to humiliate Gavin Newsom and Karen Bass. Trump has a right to federalize Guard forces, which is how they were deployed. He has never respected the traditions of American civil military relations. So in the longer run, Trump may be trying to create a national emergency to enable him to exercise authoritarian control. And the American system was never meant to cope with a rogue president. As unsatisfying as it may be for some citizens to hear, the last thing anybody should do is take to the streets of LA and try to confront them. Not unless you're well trained in civil disobedience, the way Martin Luther King's folks were. Don't do it. Just don't do it. The president and his coterie want people walking around taking selfies in gas clouds, waving Mexican flags, holding up traffic, and burning cars. Judging by reactions on social media, a lot of people seem to think that's heroic, which means they're poised to give Trump's enforcers exactly what they're hoping for. Don't do it. You will not be heroes. You will be the pretext.
Well, I certainly lighting cars on fire seems, well, I'm not even certain what that's supposed to do, but that's not super fun. And,
right. Same thing here.
They are banging on about the flags. The Republicans love hanging their hat on that, even though, I don't know. Have you seen the flags they took to January 6th? They weren't great.
Stephen Bechelos writes, Trump wanted this escalation. Trump's calling for 2,000 National Guard soldiers to spread fear and crack down on dissent. This is a time for nonviolent defiance. And again, it doesn't have to be in the street in the face of these guardsmen.
Could be on the sidewalk. It's allowed.
Yeah. Don't do it.
Okay. Well, all right. We've got a first break coming up. So if you were thinking of heading to Los Angeles during the break, why don't you stick around for segment 2 and decide whether or not it is truly worth it before you incur the expense. The plane tickets are not cheap. If you're planning on walking, the whole thing could be over by the time you get there. Alternatively, if you're thinking of taking a self-driving taxi, you're not going to want to do that either. Apparently, that's what everybody is lighting on fire, which is actually kind of funny, minus the whole violence and property destruction thing. Apparently, they have those self-driving taxis there, and if you want a car to light on fire, but you don't have one, and all the other people are keeping their cars away from you, you can get on the app and demand that a car come to you, and then they're lighting them on fire. And that is actually kind of funny.
Firebomb it.
Right. Well, that one has a person in it, and so you don't want to do that.
I got a story about that after the break.
Okay. Be right back.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Coast, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. And, all right, everything's settled down in L.A., or are they still at it?
I don't know.
I took 2 minutes.
It's early morning.
Asked everybody to leave. Yeah, that's true. So people could be out for a very early breakfast at the bakeries or manning barricades. I'm not certain which. Are they? Right. Do they have bakeries? Who knows?
So
LA, they're weird. That's carbs. We don't eat it. So.
The timeline, just to remind people, it's something like 1973, Spiro Agnew resigns. 1974, Nixon resigns.
Okay.
And somewhere before Agnew resigned the vice presidency in disgrace for taking bribes.
Man.
Huh.
Well,
what a funny,
that's so
naive era.
Yeah.
Agnew went to Boston while I was still in college. Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts state that voted for McGovern in 72.
Okay. Yeah, so
and
not great.
He attended a fundraiser. My hazy recollection is that it was at the Boston Armory, and there were protests, and I was part of the protest. And there were mounted police guarding the armory from the protesters, who must have been, several thousand strong. And my recollection of the evening is that it was a peaceful march until some Yahoo lit a car on fire, at which time the mounted police charged the crowd, driving them back. Police horses bite, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know
and
that.
they're like camels. And it was a really messy situation, and it turned out the person setting the car on fire was an undercover agent for the police. So it was a provocation that they started that, and it's one of the reasons why you scratch your head and saying, why are these idiot protesters doing this? Sometimes it's not the protesters.
Yeah. So the
and
analogy
sometimes it's
now,
anarchists who have nothing to do with the protest. So you never know. It's always complicated. It doesn't matter because the police are going to use this as a pretext regardless.
Yeah, that's true. In that sense, it won't matter very much. And, once they've hit you over the head.
Yeah, by the time you sort it out, the police riots already happened
myself.
and they've declared martial law. So
but
you just
he
have
did
to be
it,
really,
and
really
he's a
careful.
cop. Yeah.
One way to take care of this, by the way, is to only have 4 people show up, the 4 police provocateurs. That's one of the reasons why Tom Nichols is saying be really careful about how you do this. You have to police your protests.
Now,
you have to be really, really
by the
careful.
way, keep in mind that was part of the what we would call semi-plan, I guess. On January 6th, they were pretty sure. The weirdo rioters were pretty sure that they were going to be confronted by and possibly even overwhelmed by Antifa super soldiers, and they wanted to kind of use that as a pretext too. And everybody said, "We're not going to that thing. What are you, crazy? We don't want anything to do with that." And
so it's actually
but now it's a national heroic day, and everybody's pardoned. So okay, in the long run,
but it's a very good resistance tactic to stay away from it.
That's true. And they do these things, and they do try to entrap folks in it. And lighting a car on fire, by the way, lighting a car on fire in the era of leaded gasoline, extra dumb, but okay. You don't want that happening. And do we remember what kind of car it was? Because it could be a real tragedy if it was a beautiful classic, which at the time was, a dime a dozen.
Yeah, it's even worse if you try to light up an Icelandic pony. So I don't know what kind of car it was. But, it was a vehicle. It was a travel vehicle of some sort.
Yeah, and probably people thought, well, what a hunk of crap anyway. And now the guys, if you made it through the protest, are restoring those cars to their former glory. I don't know. Anyway, don't light anything on fire, and if the guy next to you lights something on fire, maybe move away.
Leave.
Okay.
Yeah, don't sit next to him on the subway. So this is from CBS. Trump's deportation program nets positive approval amid contrasting views over its scope, CBS News poll finds. And as usual, these polls are nuanced. You have to read them very carefully. Don't just take the headline at face value. I'll give you an example. They do a pretty good job in explaining this in the first 3 paragraphs.
Okay.
The survey was completed just prior to Saturday's protests and events in L.A. Views of the Trump administration's deportation program headed into this weekend with positive net approval from Americans, including strong backing from Republicans.
Is that right?
Also heavily shaped by contrasting views about which people, how many, are being targeted. A slight majority feel the administration's deportations are prioritizing people they believe are dangerous criminals. Those who say this are very supportive of the program. But if people don't think it's dangerous criminals who are the focus of the deportation effort, support drops dramatically.
Yes. And
so this is where controlling the narrative matters, but that's not what you can do anymore. Rather, this is more a focus of where do you get your news? Amy Walters made this point several times. We have, of course, for years. Where you get your news is going to determine what news you see. And what news you see is going to determine what you think about these things.
Yes.
So if you only watch Fox News, these Antifa super soldiers are in fact dangerous MS-13 gang members, all of them, each and every one of them, including the ones born in Peoria.
Right.
Because that's what they say. If you get your news from the New York Times, you'll realize that's not at all true. And the U.S. is lying about everything. That is to say the Trump administration is lying about everything. But if you watch Fox News, you won't know they're lying.
Right.
You won't know. You simply won't know.
You could be watching Fox News, but you live in Kennett, Missouri, and you realize, oh, I just got my news at the Waffle House and found out that they're arresting Cheryl.
My waitress.
Or was it Cheryl? Carol. I don't know. Carol. Yeah, and Cheryl, too, because she's a real troublemaker.
Well, yeah.
Honestly.
Yeah. Cheryl's a friend of hers, so good enough. You're right.
Right. Well, rabble rousing, and they were about to use the griddle to set a car on fire, probably. So yeah, there are a few people that learn, firsthand, and that's what's going on, and where people are exposed to the realities of who's being arrested and deported, and realizing this isn't what I meant, or at least I'm willing to tell the newspaper people around, this isn't what I voted for. I meant dangerous criminals, not my friends.
Right, exactly. Half of Americans say Trump is deporting more people than they thought he would,
Yes.
and most in this group disapprove of the program. Some of this is tied to views on process. Those people are also more apt than others to say potential deportees should get a hearing and due process.
Yeah.
So it's one thing to, deport dangerous criminals, legal or otherwise. And it's another thing
that is the number of things
to deport those who aren't dangerous criminals. Right now, 53-47, the public as a whole thinks that Trump is prioritizing dangerous criminals. They don't know. They're wrong. They get their news from the wrong places.
They're finding out
that will change
slowly
over time. Just
Yes.
like the opinions about the Vietnam War changed despite the rah-rah
true, right.
columnists who pushed it, or in a
And Nixon's
era
impeachment.
perhaps more familiar to you, for you young'uns, in the George W. Bush era, freedom fries and columnists who pushed the Iraq War, and it was unpatriotic to say otherwise.
Yeah.
Opinion changes over time.
Yes. Yes, absolutely true. And it takes a while and longer than you want, certainly. But it does change, and it's worth pointing that out. And as you pointed out during all the impeachment trials at the beginning, or in the beginning and the early stages of the process, people were not in favor of impeaching Nixon, and it took a long time to bring people around, and public hearings to bring people around, and the uncovering of more evidence, and the careful, meticulous building of a case.
So again, this poll is very helpful in separating what do you think they're doing, and too many people think that they're just sending criminals out because that's what they say, or that's where the news that they receive
it takes a long
reports
time to
on
get this across to people. You're right.
Or what should they do?
Who,
we win
me?
on what should they do, in other words.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
We lose on what people think they're actually doing.
Yes. Okay.
And as people get more information, the what are they actually doing is subject to change. What should they do? Not so much. What should happen if Trump administration wants to deport a non-U.S. citizen? 63% said they should get a court hearing first. 37% said they should just deport them. So that's basically where the country is right now. We are the 63. They are the 37. However, if they can convince you that we're only doing criminals, the numbers shift a little bit, but not in terms of what they actually should do.
Yeah. All right.
Right.
Yes.
Independents are completely split, 49-51. Democrats don't like what the administration is doing, 18-82, and Republicans love it, 93-7. These days, you're a Republican if you love that stuff, so that's not surprising.
Yes. Not exciting, but not surprising either. Right. And a lot of, by the way, a lot of what eventually, over a much longer period of time than we were comfortable with, but still relatively quickly, the thing that changed a lot of minds about, well, what are they actually doing and how do you feel about that, was the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. And guess who's back in town? Right.
Because they lied about everything. So if you ask Trump's stated goals, which is only get criminals, the American public likes that 55-45. If you ask them about, the way Trump is approaching this, including perhaps, getting too many people and the wrong people in their crosshairs there, 44-56 against. So people recognize that Trump's rhetoric and Trump's actions are not the same. They're juggling what to think about that as time goes on. You have to take steps that bring things closer to where we think they should be. And again, one of the ways is to avoid setting cars on fire.
Yeah, that's one of the things that people have difficulty connecting to. Like in the beginning of not only everywhere else, but even in L.A., this whole thing kind of started along lines we've seen elsewhere in the country, where ICE raids were going on. They were over the top. They were targeting people that really shouldn't be targeted, and that people were willing to tell people, the pollsters, they disagreed about targeting, and they were coming out in support of and in protest of their arrest, and even in some cases trying to prevent their arrest. It's just, I don't know. LA loves fire. I don't know, but
well, look, trying to
the
prevent
cars on
their
fire,
arrest and being that confrontational is fraught with difficulty.
It is.
You don't know what you're doing, and you don't know exactly how to approach that. Be extremely, extraordinarily careful.
Yeah, people had
sometimes
some luck
discretion is the better part of valor. It's not that you don't care. It's not that you're being a coward. For all of those sideline people, where are the people out in the streets protesting? You're trying not to give them a pretext.
Yeah. They've done it successfully in some other towns, and I don't know whether they were trained or not, but it didn't give the appearance that they were professionals. But it was a different setting and a different crowd for sure. And I don't know, but for whatever reason in LA, they tend to go to the burning car pretty quickly.
I'm ranting
in places
on this
that they don't,
because
they've had more success.
Literally been there and done that.
Yes.
Not set the cars on fire,
no,
but I was part of the protest.
You were there.
I saw what happened.
Been there, saw that.
Don't repeat it.
All you're going to say. My client says not done that, Your Honor. I don't think you heard him correctly. He said saw that.
Yeah.
So I done saw that. He's not very educated. Thank you.
Yeah, that's true.
All right. Don't admit to anything you don't have to. Yes. Well, be careful. Leave flammable materials at home. And move away from people with open flames.
Don't bring your Alinsky handbook with you, okay?
Yeah, right. Because everybody
and you're better
has
off not
them.
wearing a mask.
Right.
Let them wear the masks.
That's true. That's the great irony. Trump is out there posting on his Truth Social, arrest all the people in masks.
We need masks because there's going to be tear gas. Well, then don't go.
Well, yeah. Right. What can I tell you? I don't know anything about how to prepare for tear gas. I mean, I do, having seen it in passing, people telling me that. But, yeah, personal experience with tear gas has usually been like, oh, my God, help, tear gas, let's leave.
Yeah.
So, and that's the intended effect. So, okay, well, I can't teach anybody how to participate in that sort of confrontation or protest. I can only point you to others. And I guess say that if you haven't read it and don't intend to comply with it, yeah, you're probably better off for all concerned by leaving.
Right. So this is an interesting situation here.
Yes, all right.
You have Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, and Dan Bongino.
That guy.
Bongino, deputy, Kash Patel, chief over at the FBI.
Right.
Pam Bondi, attorney general, in theory, their boss. They're all crooks. They're all liars. But what's most interesting about them is they're all people who have pandered to QAnon conspiracy theory. Now they're caught in that trap because their constituents are really unhappy with them, that they're not following up on the Pizzagate-style conspiracy theory.
Yes.
Because it turns out it's not true. Big article about that in the New York Times. Once champions of fringe causes, now in a trap of their own making, top leaders at the Justice Department and the FBI are struggling to fulfill Trump campaign promises, often rooted in misinformation and conspiracy theories. So eventually, the truth will out.
Yeah.
Patel, Bongino, and other leaders are caught in a trap of their own making, said Russell Muirhead, a politics professor at Dartmouth, who had studied the role of conspiracy theories in American politics. The world they helped create, a world in which conspiracy destroys facts, is now the world they have to inhabit.
Okay.
One former Republican congressional staff member with ties to the White House, speaking on the condition of anonymity for fear of being targeted, right? Speaking on the condition of fear,
right?
Said that the president's courting of far-right conspiracists had stoked expectations, creating a never-ending cycle of demands. The person likened it to feeding red meat to insatiable sharks or zombies. Ms. Bondi learned that the hard way when she promised new revelations on the Epstein case. Turns out Elon Musk says that that's because Trump's in those tapes, so you'll never see him.
Yeah.
So you're always going to disappoint people. Mr. Trump is in the Epstein files, he wrote on social media, without providing evidence. That's why they haven't been made public.
There's evidence. No
request for comment returned. So a lot of that going on. it turns out the Musk-Trump feud is quite real and taking some really nasty turns. It's overshadowed by what's going on in LA. It's overshadowed by the beautiful bill as it works its way through Congress that's going to kick 11 million people off of their health insurance. Nice article in the New York Times about Medicaid work requirements in Arkansas, and it doesn't work. Don't do it.
Right,
and
sure.
It makes constituents unhappy and they hate you. But
Like
they're not
cars
listening.
on fire.
Yeah.
Not
So
that angry, but
that's
okay.
basically what's going on in the news these days.
Yeah. Okay. That is what's going on in the news. We did mention, I mean,
That
just
plus tariff
briefly in
failures.
passing. Oh, yeah. Okay. That'll help fix
They're on,
things,
they're
too.
off, they're on, they're off.
Right.
Well, what's Trump policy about anything? On, off, on, off.
Tacos.
Refers to more than just the tariffs.
Yes. They're flouting the tariffs, the taco people. I don't know. We got to come up with some other. Burrito would be a tough acronym.
Right.
Taco is great because it's short. And just stick with that. But
the latest jobs report actually had a big sore spot, as they point out in
it was Jobs
TNR,
Friday.
Greg Sargent interviewing an economist. The big sore spot in the jobs report is a loss of 8,000 manufacturing jobs.
But
so
I was told,
yeah, we're certainly holding steady, and as we increase construction jobs and healthcare jobs and manufacturing plants, it'll take some time. But there's a couple of things here. Notice the admission that it'll take time for the tariffs to reshore manufacturing jobs, and you can't just do this, start and stop it. And manufacturing jobs are being lost. That is, as Joe Biden might say, a BFD.
Yes.
Because after all, the whole idea was manufacturing jobs.
Well, the idea has been about 6 different ideas, but that's the last one that they haven't dropped, and it's not working. So, yeah, that's news too. And I think I did see yesterday something about Britain, which early on in the succession of bilateral discussions about defusing the tariff situation, was one of the early ones to come to an agreement. And apparently the British are saying, so when is that tariff thing going to drop on us? Like, when are you going to lower your tariffs, United States? We came to an agreement, I thought, or at the very least we agreed to agree. When are we going to meet and talk about taking those tariffs down? So I guess that's probably in about 2 weeks or some other very short period of time. But even the few agreements that they've announced in the March to 90 agreements in 90 days have not panned out. And those were just agreements to talk more. And they didn't even do that. But they've been distracted, I guess, by some other thing. It's all a distraction. The Jobs Friday report, too. I did get an email ahead of time from Jeremy Freiberger, who's been monitoring how closely he thinks, and most economists think, the economic indicator the reports actually reflect reality, or are they being sweetened by the Trump administration? And it is interesting that most economists and the ADP early peek at the job situation said, yeah, not actually a great situation at all. But lo and behold, the quote-unquote official Jobs Friday report says, no, actually much better than expected. Not great, but certainly better than expected. So they're not completely lying their asses off and just saying they've created millions and millions of jobs, but they do seem to be getting different results than independent assessors are getting on a fairly regular basis. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on as we go on. And don't burn any cars over it, I'm just saying.
Right. I mean, there's already here up in New England, we get the residual of Canadian wildfire smoke. So burning cars just makes the air even worse.
That's true. And we don't know for sure that they're forests, not cars, because the dangerous and mysterious enemy to the north could be doing anything. It's time to invade, clearly.
Now, Terry Moran.
Oh, yeah.
I should mention, he was suspended from ABC News. My first thought is, ABC News must be wanting some sort of merger.
Probably something. What are they up to? I don't know.
But Terry Moran posted something, which I'll
okay.
read to you before it was taken down.
Oh, my God.
The thing about
Censorship.
Stephen Miller is not that he is the brains behind Trumpism. He's one of the people who conceptualizes the impulses of the Trumpist movement and translates them into policy. But that's not what's interesting about Miller. It's not brains, it's bile. Miller is a man who's richly endowed with the capacity for hatred. He's a world-class hater. None of that is untrue. But he said it, and ABC suspended him. And I can understand that, given a corporate, sensibility about news reporters being overactive on social media. But he is 100% correct on everything he said, and he shouldn't have been suspended for it.
Yeah.
I understand that he was,
it's not even
but he
really
shouldn't
bad. Right.
I mean, if I were him, I wouldn't have said that because this would probably happen.
I mean, I guess if he didn't want it, maybe he wanted. Maybe he was provoking a confrontation like Trump. I don't know, but it doesn't appear so. Terry Moran, mixed feelings about Terry Moran. He's been kind of an irritant in the past, but so I will say this: I'm not opposed to radicalizing him if that is the outcome.
Yeah.
But okay.
Yeah, and
this was not.
What I would say is in his defense is, look, he's irritating. What's your problem?
Yeah, right. I don't know. Exactly. I don't need the guy suspended. Certainly not for this. I don't know. Who knows? It may be Terry Moran is kind of he runs hot and cold. I'm not certain that there hasn't been a time when I've thought that guy should be suspended for what he just said. But I don't know. I don't think so. But at any rate, that's about as mild. It's not even that's not even upsetting. That's not even something you'll be sued for. And that's if that's
simple
the standard.
truth.
Yeah. Right. Well, Stephen Miller is a special case to be sure, and he hung around, and the buzz around the country and the planet is that he's the one actually pulling the levers and maybe even signing the orders for all we know, unless the auto pen has been brought out. Because in the middle of all this, Trump was at UFC fights. I don't know if he played golf yesterday or not, but Stephen Miller was present in the White House doing the Al Haig thing. And all of a sudden, troops are being deployed, even as Trump is, munching popcorn in the audience at the UFC fight. So who knows what's going on there? But it sounds like he seems to have free reign, Stephen Miller, to kind of do what he wants to do, as long as you don't interrupt Trump's weekend. It's bad news, generally speaking. By the way, speaking of the upcoming huge parade, tanks and armored personnel carriers and various cool-looking equipment, apparently, arriving by the trainload in Washington, D.C. in preparation for this thing. No word yet how they're going to avoid completely destroying the streets when they do it. I don't know whether there is a plan for avoiding that.
It's a jobs
damage.
program.
I guess so.
Fix the streets.
Maybe. But also of
DC
interest.
loves traffic and congestion. Just love it.
And we never vote for people based on their opposition to it or anything like that, as you know. But this is an interesting case, and I think probably will find its way, this and LA both will find their way into some of the pleadings in court these days whenever the administration needs to justify things that they do on the basis, as they actually do, claim to the courts that an invasion is going on. We're being literally invaded from over the southern border. And yet, all the visuals leading up to LA were of all the military equipment in Texas moving 1,500 miles in the opposite direction for a birthday party for the orange guy versus, oh my God, we're being invaded. Or, oh my God, there are riots. He signed something, maybe, kind of. We don't know whether he signed it. We don't know if it really exists. We don't see the documents. There wasn't the big public show like they usually have. But one of them declared California to be in a state of rebellion against the federal government because two guys burned a car. And, that means something, and it's meant to give legal recourse for triggering certain reactions. But it's not happening. But again, if there's a rebellion in the country that you need to put down with the military, you can't be at the UFC fights eating popcorn and taking selfies with people. If there's an invasion at the southern border, you can't be shipping all of the military equipment in the other direction for birthday party rentals. It doesn't work like that. It shouldn't work like that at any rate. It does work like that, unfortunately, in this country. And even though we know that this is not how this works. Right, exactly. He is doing it, and I'm wondering whether we'll start to see that in the court pleadings, and as presented as evidence. It's clearly not an invasion, clearly not a rebellion going on. Just as there was no reaction to January 6th in the White House, watching things on TV and snacking. It's kind of his habit. All right. Well, we're very near the end here today.
Well,
surprise. You stayed again.
That's it. Done. Finished.
Okay. Well, great. Except for the fact that it's not so great because now I have to do the rest of it. But that is fine. And we'll get together again on Wednesday. Thursday, I disappear.
Oh, okay.
Like Cinderella's carriage, I guess. At midnight on Wednesday. I disappear. So,
you turn into a pumpkin.
That's right. And I'm dressing up as Trump. And I will be back the following Thursday. So there'll be a big gap. We'll just have to, tweet and blue sky post to one another for a while.
Thursday, Monday, and Wednesday. So I'll miss 3 shows.
Right. Well, we'll all miss those 3 shows.
Okay.
Won't we really? Boo-hoo. Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm hard at work trying to figure out what the hell I'm going to do for this time. But we have one more visit left on Wednesday, so let's look forward to that. Thanks, Greg.
Okay.
Well, take care, and we'll see you then. Okay. Very good. And I am prepared at this point I'm prepared to play the music. It's just not time for it yet. 10 seconds to go for all of you anticipating that event, that milestone.
Wrong, sir.
Wrong. Says who? No, I'm correct. Now, that was not even a planned thing. That was me clicking to get the dialogue box out of the way that says that Greg had left the Zoom. So, or whatever the hell it is we use. We used to use Skype. Yeah, now we're on Zoom. I forget. And then it disappeared on me, and I just happened to be positioned over the wrong. But it works very well, really, honestly. All right, we'll be back with more after this. Believe it or not, there is other news, and we'll catch up with some of it. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. So, what do I do here? I mentioned to you that there was some nuance to the particular methodology by which the White House declared the necessary conditions in order to try to, and all I can say is purport to, dispatch California National Guard troops, and it later turns out they now are saying some 500 Marines. Now, throughout all of this, I've just been I try to remain, I guess, healthily skeptical of all of this. I just remember that Trump is terrible at taking care of paperwork. And of course, he was away from the White House for most of the weekend, so it was unlikely that the normal mechanisms there for taking care of paperwork were at hand for him. And I do suspect that some of these things were done without correctly handling paperwork. And some of them absolutely required paperwork. And I was a little skeptical that and amazed, as usual, that the news media was not skeptical, that when the president posts on Truth Social that I hereby order the National Guard, 2,000 California National Guard troops, regardless of what the stupid governor says, to march on it, to arrest everybody with masks. Like, that hasn't happened, right? Is that an order? Are people following it? And I guess, what interested me about the whole situation was, okay, I understand that there is a legal mechanism whereby the president of the United States, or whoever's, whoever it is that's acting in that capacity, can, quote unquote, federalize National Guard troops without the cooperation of that state's governor, who is ordinarily, nominally the commander of the National Guard. And I can understand that that's the case, but I assume that requires certain paperwork. It's one thing for Trump to say, I'm going to do it. And it's another even for him to actually mean it when he says he's going to do it. The question is, did he do it? And what's the result? And are those troops moving? somewhere there's a base where these troops report to get their orders, and somewhere there's an officer who says, I did or did not get these orders. And that officer also has the option of saying, I believe this is or isn't a legal order, or I need to consult with somebody. But at the very least, I assume that generally speaking, even the supporters inside of the military who have to deal with the chain of command and the military code of justice, etc., are going to say, I heard that the president said something on Truth Social, but I need to go to my desk and find out whether there's anything on the fax machine or in my email, or do I get a phone call? Something has to happen that tells me this is a real thing and I need to do some work on it. I need to move some of my troops, right? And if you just tweet stuff, nothing's going to happen at the desk of the commander, right? So some paperwork has to happen here. And then, of course, there's the next level of question, which is that order legal? I did get it. Should I follow it? Is another question. But before we even get to that, the Legal Eagles came out to point this stuff out. There is a difference in the way you can mobilize troops of different kinds and what it means, and the likelihood of, one, getting it right, and two, doing the paperwork for Trump. I mean, I think it's pretty low. That doesn't mean that the troops won't move. They may be moving illegally or improperly, but they may yet move. But then it's also worth pointing out, all we really had at the beginning was Trump said he was going to do this thing and said that it was going to be 2,000 troops, and then said there was going to be 500 Marines. And as Karen Bass, mayor of Los Angeles, was pointing out, Trump had said that, and I already dispatched them, and they're already there, and they already won, as a matter of fact. And Karen Bass, the following day, on Sunday morning, was like, Trump has spent the last 12 hours tweeting that he's conquered Los Angeles. But remember, he also said he sent the army to turn on the big spigot of water in California. So he's actually got a history of making stuff up about dispatching the military to California. Now, in this case, they're there, but they were already there because they're California National Guard. But some question as to why they're there, what they think they're doing there, and how quickly they can be dispatched. But Trump doesn't like to wait for things. So by Sunday morning, Karen Bass pointed out, Trump has spent the whole night saying that the National Guard has been nationalized, federalized, and dispatched and restored order in Los Angeles. But I'm here to tell you, I am the mayor of Los Angeles. Those troops are not here. They may come later in the day, but they're not here yet. So this nonsense about I sent doesn't really add up. I sent 2,000 troops. Did you? Maybe yes, maybe no, but we don't know anything about it. Meanwhile, Trump actually then went on to say, and they've already achieved victory. The troops that hadn't arrived yet had already achieved victory. Not that they'd left, but there was that. Then, is it 2,000? Yes, no, maybe. Is it California? We didn't know at the time. He said he was going to federalize the California Guard. There was some possibility that the California Guard was going to say, no, thanks. And people wondered, does that mean, would he send the Idaho Guard? Or, could he do that? And no, but yes, that sort of situation. Then the 500 Marines, really? Or is that just him talking out of his hat? Don't know. Anyway, right. So then, as I said, the Legal Eagles were out, and we have Steve Vladeck making commentary, and the guys and gals over at Lawfare as well. Let's see if we can't dig these things up. Here's Steve Vladeck on Blue Sky noting, here is the, quote, presidential memorandum, pointing to the White House website, which, not exactly presidential language here, but he notes, for the record, there is no Insurrection Act invocation. That comes with its own consequences and allows different things, for one thing. But that's always been the threat. And everybody has always said, Trump is looking for a pretext to invoke the Insurrection Act. Yes, maybe. Did he get it? Well, he got, well, everybody's talking about the provocations that he's already instigated and the pretext that he's already gotten, and yet no Insurrection Act, something different. So what was it? Steve Vladeck says there's no Insurrection Act invocation in this presidential memorandum, which he encloses in scare quotes. Trump is federalizing, or says he's federalizing, 2,000 California National Guard personnel, but only, quote, to protect federal functions. Okay, that means something. Without invoking the Insurrection Act, anything more than protecting federal functions, guarding federal installations, making sure people can get in and out of the federal installation to do their work, whatever it is. But without that, anything more, like if we use the 2,000 California National Guard troops to arrest people with masks, like he is insisting that they do via Truth Social, that would be a violation of the Posse Comitatus Act, which, while serious, is also should be remembered. Oh no, Trump broke the law. That's crazy. So maybe they'll do it anyway. The screen grab that Vladeck is looking at here is from the White House, it's a pretty sizable snippet here. It reads, in light of these incidents and credible threats of continued violence, which aren't really all that credible, by the authority vested in me, should we be reading? I mean, this isn't Trump-like words, but they are allegedly Trump's words. It's one of the reasons we know he didn't do this stuff. And maybe he didn't even sign it. We don't know. In light of these incidents, we'll give him the voice for this, and credible threats of continued violence by the authority vested in me as president, by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, I hereby call into federal service members and units of the National Guard under, and this is important, 10 U.S. Code, should be section, but they forgot the Silk Row here for some reason. They couldn't find that key on the keyboard. That's how hastily prepared this was. Section 12406, 10 U.S. Code 12406, to temporarily protect ICE and other United States government personnel who are performing federal functions, including the enforcement of federal law, and to protect federal property at locations where protests against these functions are occurring or likely to occur based on current threat assessments and planned operations. If we think it's going to happen, that's reason enough for us to put troops there. That's what they're saying. Further, I direct and delegate actions as necessary for the Secretary of Defense, that drunkard, to coordinate with the governors of the states and the National Guard Bureau in identifying and ordering into federal service the appropriate members and units of the National Guard under this authority. The members and units of the National Guard called into federal service shall be at least 2,000 National Guard personnel, and the duration of the duty shall be for 60 days, or at the discretion of the Secretary of Defense, that drunkard. I'm not saying it, he is. In addition, the Secretary of Defense may employ any other members of the regular armed forces as necessary to augment and support the protection of federal functions and property in any number determined appropriate in his discretion. And he has no discretion. That's the problem with that guy. He's roofing women at women's conferences, for God's sake. Anyway, what this means is that, yes, the Project 2025 people had this prepared and ready to go, even though they couldn't find the Silk Row character, and that's kind of sad. But, because we like to see Silk Rows. But yeah, they had the paperwork, they understood it to some extent and had it prepared and ready to go. Because remember, he's at the UFC fights. He's not there dictating this, and this he would never be anything he would say anyway. But yeah, probably put together by Stephen Miller and his crew rather than Donald Trump and his crew. Now, as Vladeck points out, it authorizes something slightly different and without resort overtly to the Insurrection Act, troops doing anything other than guarding federal buildings would be a no-no under the Posse Comitatus Act. Not that he cares, for any serious amount of time, whether or not he's breaking the law or violating the Constitution. So let's see. Lawfare Media also addressed the situation in somewhat perhaps more detail. The National Guard in Los Angeles by Chris Mirasola, written and published for Sunday morning. The president hasn't invoked the Insurrection Act. He's instead relying on a theory of inherent constitutional power that is far more limited, or at least supposed to be far more limited. We'll see how he treats it. What's we got here? Chris Mirasola, once again, writing late yesterday. This was done on Sunday, so talking about Saturday. President Donald Trump signed, allegedly, I would say, a presidential proclamation mobilizing 2,000 National Guard personnel, or purporting to anyway, to respond to protests against ICE immigration raids in Los Angeles. This is not an invocation of the Insurrection Act. Instead, the president has relied on a far more limited, though also quite old, theory, not a law, but theory of inherent presidential authority known as the protective power. In tandem with this theory of constitutional authority, the president has also relied on an emergency statutory authority, 10 U.S. Code Section 12406, previously mentioned, to mobilize National Guard personnel to undertake the duties authorized under the protective power, if any, because it's just a theory. There has been significant mischaracterization of what the president has authorized in the memorandum signed yesterday. That frequently happens. Governor Gavin Newsom has criticized, for example, a complete takeover of the California National Guard. That is not provided for in the memo. Here is what the memo does provide. First, it characterizes protests ongoing since Friday against ICE raids in the Los Angeles area as threatening the, quote, faithful execution of federal immigration laws. May or may not be the case, but that's what they say the protests are doing. It also states that violent protests threaten the security of and significant damage to federal immigration detention facilities and other federal property. The first paragraph concludes by asserting that, quote, to the extent that protests or acts of violence directly inhibit the execution of the laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the United States. In other words, pretty close to the sedition charges that we correctly levied against the January 6th rioters and for which they were duly convicted, but from which they were largely pardoned by Donald Trump because he wants to flip the script and pretend that that was a peaceful day of love and that these protests are the real rebellion and insurrection. Kind of interesting. We'll see whether he charges anybody with setting that rebellion on foot under the Insurrection Act. I'd be curious to see whether that happens. How ironic would that be to remind everybody that that's a weapon that should have been used against Trump when they had him, but they didn't, and golly, look what happened now. So we'll see. At any rate, yes, also worth mentioning here in passing, because he was complaining about the protests and the nature of the protests. Best description I saw that made sense of how this stuff really kind of started. ICE was conducting raids looking for people that they could snatch away from their families and lock up, whether they were criminals or wanted or illegals or not illegal or American citizens, whoever, as long as they were brown and plausibly looked like they could be passed off as immigrants. They were snatching them up from Home Depot. Why Home Depot? This is part of the reason why everybody thinks Stephen Miller is the one calling the shots. Stephen Miller was apparently screaming at people the other day about not meeting his preferred pace for snatching people up and deporting them, or at the very least snatching people up. That's what he was really after. And sort of saying, all these arrests are being made, but how come when I go to Home Depot or 7-Eleven, there's Hispanic people all over the place? They're crawling all over the place. They're swarming. But they're outside very often, at least in the Washington, D.C. area, and I'm sure everywhere else too, there are people, day laborers looking for, honest work for the day. And they hang around in certain places where it's known to the employers they can find them. It's an employment situation. Why the Home Depot? Because that's where the contractors who are building things, construction contractors, go for materials. And then while they're there, they say, I need a crew of 6 guys who, can shingle a roof or can frame a house, whatever it is I'm working on today. If you can do that work, hop in the truck. I'll pay you for today's work. 7-Eleven, because, that's where the bosses stop for coffee on the way to the job. This is just a known gathering places. So, of course, Stephen Miller was upset. I go there and they're still there. I have to look at them. It's very unpleasant for me because I hate them so much and we want some raids there. So they complied. They went to Home Depot and they decided to stage some of their stupid arrests, regardless of the immigration status of the people they were snatching. But in addition, they decided we're also going to bring smoke and tear gas and percussion grenades, flash bangs, as they're now calling them, and in case there's any trouble. But to do that at a Home Depot in Los Angeles also means blocking off traffic to do it. And blocking off traffic is just about the worst thing you can do almost anywhere, but certainly Los Angeles is one of the worst places you could do it. But one of the people who was interviewed on, by somebody on TikTok or interviewed by, journalists and filmed by a bystander watching the interview, whatever the situation was, basically said they were driving down the street minding their own business along with everybody else when all of a sudden traffic got stopped. And so they're sitting there at the traffic and the lights changing, red, green, some yellows in between. Nobody's moving because traffic's blocked. So they're irritated. What's going on here? People start looking to see what's going on. And of course, that's a big problem because now cops are being looked at and they don't like that. And then people are getting out of their cars. Why? Because traffic's been stopped for a couple minutes. What's going on around here anyway? Getting out of your cars, why? That's hostile. Get back in your vehicle, citizen. Get back in your vehicle. All of a sudden now starts floating the tear gas. And people are like, is that tear gas? And now they're filming. And then that's too much. The cops are now saying those people are... And the witness here who's telling his story says he hears one of the commanders say, go after the people with the phones. They're very irritated by people filming what they're doing. Even though they're not even doing anything that's visible at that point, people are still trying to get out of their cars to figure out what's going on. But now they're out of their cars and filming. We have a riot on our hands, or at least something we're willing to call a riot. And then they started pulling the phones out of people's hands, pushing people to the ground, clubbing them, threatening them with arrest, etc. The tear gas is coming. People are choking. People who stayed in their cars trying to obey the law now have tear gas in their car and they're choking and they get out of the cars and then, you got out of the car. This is a violation of section blah, blah, blah that we just made up, and you get whacked over the head. So it's understandable that people who weren't even there to protest are now protesting because they're being roughed up because they had the poor luck to be at the traffic light when they stopped traffic to conduct their staged Home Depot raid. And then they so irritated and harassed bystanders that they had pushback from bystanders who weren't even there to do anything about the immigration situation. So it's getting worse and worse. And now we find ourselves in this situation, and now with a presidential memo. So back to Chris Mirasola's piece about what's going on here legally, right? The first paragraph of the presidential memorandum, or whatever it is he's calling it, concludes by asserting that to the extent that protests or acts of violence directly inhibit the execution of laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the United States. So, yeah, if you are stopped in traffic outside of a federal building where protesters have showed up and the police decide they need to block traffic in order to beat up the protesters, or perhaps the protesters have stopped traffic in order to make their protest known, and then the gas comes out to disperse them, and you're stuck in your car and you get out of your car because you're choking to death inside your car. Is that an act of violence directly inhibiting the execution of laws and therefore a form of rebellion against the authority of the United States? Yes! You're all under arrest, says Stephen Miller. This last sentence, Mirasola continues, the rest of that having been my embellishment of it, the last sentence is essential to the first legal move made in the memo. The second paragraph begins by invoking 10 U.S. Code, Section 12406, an Emergency National Guard Personnel Mobilization Authority. It is essential to have the first pause here, and distinguish Section 12406 from the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a compilation of statutes enacted across the 18th and 19th centuries, currently codified at Chapter 13 of Title 10, which is to say, this he's using is 10 United States Code Section 12406. The actual Insurrection Act will be found at 10 U.S. Code Section 13 something. It's not necessarily 406, but it's nearby, but it's very different. By the way, 10 U.S. Code Section 12406 is entitled, everyone has mentioned that it's the one that's actually being invoked. What does it say? It doesn't say Insurrection Act or anything about insurrection. It says National Guard and Federal Service, call. And is it a very long section? No, it is not. I can read you the whole thing. Whenever one, the United States or any of the Commonwealths or possessions, is invaded or is in danger of invasion by a foreign nation. No. 2, there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. And that's the one they're using. Or 3, the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. Oh, is it possible that the president we have is unable to do things? Possibly, but he didn't want to say that. Then, the president may call into federal service members and units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws. Orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states, or in the case of the District of Columbia, through the commanding general of the National Guard of the District of Columbia, period, end of section. So that's interesting. Did the Guard get mobilized? Well, it's purported that that's the case. It looks like there's National Guard troops around. Did they get mobilized through the governor of the state? No. So what happened here? Why are they there? I don't know. I'm not certain whether they know at lawfare either, but I don't know. That doesn't make any sense. And of course, the reason that's given, you can do this when there's an invasion. Now, they keep saying there's an invasion, but they didn't use that for whatever reason. So that's when they had to say, well, people got out of their cars to look at what was stopping traffic. That's rebellion. We said, disperse ye rebels, and they didn't, and that puts them in rebellion. That's why you had to use that language in your proclamation. So, again, back to what Chris Mirasola has written here. The last sentence is essential to the first legal move. They use Section 10 U.S. Code, Section 12406, distinct from the Insurrection Act. They are in Chapter 13. You can tell what chapter is Section 12406 in? 12. Not because it's 12-406, but that's essentially the taxonomy. That's what they're using. So Title 12, Chapter 12 of Title 10 is where this act that they actually pointed to mobilize the National Guard is. But it's over in Chapter 13 where the Insurrection Act is found. And the Insurrection Act is a compilation of statutes enacted from the 18th and 19th centuries, which provide the president positive statutory authority to use the military for law enforcement purposes within the United States in certain enumerated circumstances, generally regarding obstruction of federal law enforcement. Okay, broader authority, yes, but is it what's being used? No. It's a different chapter, entirely different. Chapter 12, not Chapter 13. So these troops it is said, are in theory limited to the purpose of the memorandum and the purpose allowed under Section 12406, which is the only one they mentioned, to protect federal property and the execution of federal functions. Law enforcement, rounding people up. For that, you need Chapter 13, the Insurrection Act, and for whatever reason, though they keep threatening it and writing about it and editorializing about it and talking about it on podcasts, when push came to shove, if it did, they did not mention that. Hi everybody, it's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time, just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and patreon.com, patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We got one more segment to go for today. Let's continue reading this lawfare piece by Chris Mirasola, who reminds us that for all the talk about the Insurrection Act leading up to this and this first opportunity to invoke it, they just didn't. And that has, legally speaking, if you believe in laws, a different effect. They leaned instead right on 10 U.S. Code Section 12406, and the authority that arises from that is somewhat different. So where were we here? So again, as he explains here, the Insurrection Act is this compilation of statutes. There's no just one Insurrection Act. It provides the president positive statutory authority to use the military for law enforcement purposes within the United States. And so that might strike you as odd and as contrary to the Posse Comitatus Act. But it is considered an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act, the statute that generally criminalizes using the military for domestic law enforcement purposes unless there is express statutory or constitutional authority to do so. Section 12406, on the other hand, only authorizes the president to involuntarily call National Guard personnel into federal service in one of three circumstances. I want to repeat here that all that Section 12406 does is authorize the president to bring National Guard personnel onto federal active duty if one of the following three circumstances applies. We read them. One is actual or threatened foreign invasion. No, even though they keep saying it. 2, actual or threatened rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States, like they did on January 6th. Or 3, when the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. By the way, speaking of January 6th, remember how difficult Donald Trump found it to find the authority to mobilize the National Guard at that time. It is interesting and ironic, and some might say hypocritical, that Donald Trump has suddenly found, finally, the authority to mobilize the National Guard without Nancy Pelosi's permission, somehow. That is very interesting. Anyway, the first paragraph of the presidential memorandum suggests that the president is using the second prong of the statute as the hook for involuntarily mobilizing these National Guard personnel. That's the rebellion one. This, of course, is factually contestable, to say the least. Even on the face of the memorandum is unusually weak. Note that the final sentence of the first paragraph, which alleges the rebellion, is in the conditional. We don't have the thing handy here, but does he link to it earlier? Let's see. Yeah, there's a link to the word signed. Okay, here's the proclamation from over at the White House. This is the one that Steve Vladeck was reading from in his post on Blue Sky. Department of Defense Security for the protection of Department of Homeland Security functions. It's a weird way of titling it, but that's the story. Memorandum for the Secretary of Defense, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Homeland Security. Subject, again, Department of Defense Security, providing security for the protection of the Department of Homeland Security functions. It's wordy, but what does he say in this thing that we were reading about the conditional sense? All right, let's scroll back down. The first paragraph of the presidential memorandum suggests that the president is using the second prong. Note that the final sentence of the first paragraph, which alleges the rebellion, is in the conditional. Okay, let's read that final sentence of the first paragraph. There was, of course, we're going to do this thing. In a violent protest threatened the security of and significant damage to federal immigration, detention facilities, and other federal property. By the way, a lot of these detention centers are not, strictly speaking, federal property. They're very often leased by the federal government. I don't know if that complicates anything. But here's that sentence that he was talking about. To the extent, that's hedging, to the extent that protests or acts of violence directly inhibit the execution of the laws, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. It's pretty weak, and they kind of hedge on the whole thing, which, if you're committing troops and federalizing National Guard troops, you really ought to be more sure of yourself. It's weird that they even hedge. Why do they ever hedge anything? What are they afraid of? That someone's going to find out they lied? Oh, no, not that. Anyway, we can infer that the legal authority for this mission is the protective power from the text of the second paragraph of the president's memorandum. I feel like I should have read the thing, but it's so boring and dry. We are told that the president has authorized National Guard personnel to, quote, temporarily protect ICE and other United States government personnel who are performing federal functions, including the enforcement of federal law, and to protect federal property at locations where protests against these functions are occurring or likely to occur. And again, here, just to parse this a little bit, part of the problem was ICE decided to stage their raid in the middle of town at the Home Depot and stall traffic, of course, in order to do it. And then people are getting out of their cars, et cetera, et cetera. In the end, what ended up happening was people who had, in fact, come to demonstrate against the immigration enforcement, but also the bystanders who were pissed off at just being targeted for no reason, apparently made it impossible for ICE to even decide to give up and leave the place. Not really impossible. If they had gotten back in their vans and left, they would have been fine. But they decided to tell everybody they were cornered and pinned down, and they called on the LAPD to rescue them. They very foolishly thought that they could take over all of LA somehow with whatever personnel they brought, or no one would bother them. And it turns out not to have been the case. It's particularly dumb considering that they harassed all the bystanders as well. But the LAPD would not rescue them. Neither would the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department rescue them. So they appealed for federal assistance in escaping this situation of their own making. All right, so let's, we didn't read this part. We got half of this paragraph left. But we just said we can infer that the legal authority for this mission is the protective power. We're told that the president has authorized National Guard personnel to temporarily protect ICE. And then while you're there, help extract them from Home Depot. Then you should go and guard federal property and personnel while they carry out federal functions, including the enforcement of immigration law. This phrasing of the mission is nearly identical to the text of the Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel memo, OLC, you remember them, which stands for the modern executive branch understanding of the protective power. This is an April 29th, 1971 memo in which OLC reiterated the longstanding executive branch view, and it's just a view, that the president has, quote, inherent authority That is to say, no one has written this authority down anywhere except OLC. Does it say so in the Constitution? If I said, show me in the Constitution where it says, you could show me language from which you infer it, but that's all. Show me the statute that authorizes it? Nope, no statute does that either. We don't need it, though, because the authority is inherent in the way we interpret the words that are actually in the Constitution, which don't appear to say anything about this stuff. But okay, the OLC reiterated the long-standing executive branch view that the president has inherent authority to use troops for the protection of federal property and federal functions. Could have said that in the Constitution. Pretty easy to imagine, even. They just didn't. This understanding of presidential power is based on a broad understanding of the president's authority under the Take Care Clause, right? I should take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's a bit of a stretch to say, well, that means that I can federalize National Guard troops to come and hit you over the head if I think you might be making it harder for me to execute the law as I read it, which is very different from the way other people read it, but is that really take care that the laws are faithfully executed? Or really, is that just supposed to mean essentially, well, you're supposed to make a good faith effort to execute the laws as they are currently interpreted and stop pretending that because people were mad about being stopped in traffic, it's a rebellion. Anyway, so there's the 1971 OLC memo that says that their view is the Take Care Clause means you can mobilize National Guard troops, federalize National Guard troops, in addition to dicta from the cases of In re Nagel and In re Debs, asserting what OLC calls the president's inherent powers to use troops to protect federal property and functions, as opposed to, say, repel invasions or fight foreign wars. Importantly, the protective power does not extend as far as the general authorization to undertake law enforcement functions, which the Insurrection Act provides. This is implicitly noted in a 1971 OLC memo, which ends by advising the president that he can still invoke the greater powers available under the Insurrection Act if circumstances further deteriorate. It was more explicitly recognized by former Attorney General Bill Barr in the wake of the last known invocation of this authority, that is, the military response to Black Lives Matter protests in Washington, D.C. In a letter to D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser, Barr wrote that the authority to protect federal properties included 1. Crowd control, temporary detention, cursory search, measures to ensure the safety of persons on the property, and establishment of security perimeters consistent with the peaceful exercise of First Amendment rights. 2. Protection of federal officials, employees, and law enforcement personnel from harm or threat of bodily injury. And 3. Protection of federal functions such as federal employees' access to their workplaces, which Doji disrupted more than anybody else. The free and safe movement of federal personnel throughout the city, and the continued operation of U.S. mails. That is to say, MAILS, just in case you were wondering. We see a gesture towards these limitations in presidential memorandums, in the presidential memorandum's third paragraph. It begins by stating that, quote, to carry out this mission, the deployed military personnel may perform those military protective activities that the Secretary of Defense determines are reasonably necessary to ensure the protection and safety of federal personnel and property. And of course, a lot will hang on reasonably necessary. But what would a drunk abuser know about what's reasonable? I don't know. It's a bad choice for Secretary of Defense, as it turns out. This single sentence could not be more important. The executive, again as reflected in the 1971 OLC memo, has long asserted that the protective power is not an exception to the Posse Comitatus Act because the activities authorized under the protective power are not themselves law enforcement activities. In the days to come, the public must be laser focused on seeing the extent to which Secretary Hegseth adheres to these historically recognized limitations. He, of course, will not even come close to understanding them, I'm sure, and maybe by design. There will be time in the days to come, maybe, to dig further into the twisted history of the protective power As I have written previously, and there's a little link here, the 1971 OLC opinion articulates an understanding of presidential authority that can be tracked back to President Millard Fillmore's use of the military to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act in 1950. But this history belies what I believe are significant infirmities in the executive branch's purported legal basis for the protective power. I don't want to overstate the practical significance of my critiques. There have been no meaningful challenges to the protective power that I'm aware of. And this is an area where the courts have traditionally been exceedingly deferential to the executive branch, but they usually thought that they were operating in good faith. The coming hours and days will be incredibly consequential. As this military response unfolds, we must stay focused on the limited authorization for military action, which President Trump unleashed today. It is something that you should be aware of and keep in mind. Okay, let's see. Other things in the news that I did mention in passing, but I thought maybe I should read you this thing. This has now been overtaken by events, I think. But ABC News was reporting on Friday after the show was over. I didn't get a chance to read it, but I don't know if we were aware of it in the middle of the show or not. But at that time, the word was Kilmar Abrego Garcia was being brought back, but now it's updated. He's been brought back to the U.S. and appears in court on charges of trafficking migrants. So the good news is the administration agreed to finally facilitate, thank you very much, his return to the United States. But in order to save face, because remember, they said it's not going to happen. He's never coming back, they said. And now he's coming back. So what's the reason? Well, you see, the reason we're bringing him back is, fine, you said you wanted him to come back. Fine, he can come back, but he's only going to end up in jail here. He was in the right place when he was in El Salvador. He was in jail, and he's going to be in jail whether he's here or there. So there. How come? Because we're going to say that he was trafficking. Human trafficking, for God's sake, right? And what kind of trafficking? The worst kind. Human. Although maybe zombie trafficking would be worse. I don't know. But does that mean the sort of trafficking that they say happens in Pizzagate? No, but humans are involved. And of course, it's an immigration violation because that kind of human trafficking is bringing brown people here to be arrested at Home Depot. Of course, can't have that. So did he do it? Was he involved in it? Nobody knows for sure. The point is that the Department of Justice is willing to say that he was involved in this stuff. And oddly, they never mentioned this in any of the when we kept saying, why did you scoop him up? He has no criminal record. Yeah, well, so they all of a sudden, now that he's back, oh, yeah, he was a huge criminal. I don't think so. That sounds like something you made up. And, but would the federal government in such a high profile case just completely fabricate criminal charges against him? I don't know. Would they forge electoral college votes and try to actually claim the presidency on that basis? Well, they did do that. Was it different personnel? Well, to some extent. So, this is a don't put anything past them kind of situation. So, all right, here's the ABC News updated discussion of it. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, brought back to the U.S., appears in court on charges of trafficking migrants. The mistakenly deported Salvadoran native was brought back to the U.S. on Friday. And then, they go right back to it. Mistakenly deported Salvadoran native Kilmar Abrego Garcia appeared in a Tennessee courtroom on Friday, hours after he was brought back to the United States to face criminal charges for allegedly transporting undocumented migrants within the United States. Did he do it? Well, there's some commentary that adds, not just commentary that, this administration has faked stuff before, but better evidence than that. And I'm sure it'll be mentioned in this article. And if it isn't, I'll catch you up on it, but you may already know it. More than 2 months after the Trump administration admitted it mistakenly deported Abrego Garcia from Maryland to his native El Salvador, a 2-count indictment unsealed on Friday alleges that he helped that he participated in a years-long conspiracy that they just realized to haul undocumented migrants from Texas to the interior of the country. The return of Abrego Garcia from his native El Salvador follows a series of court battles in which the Trump administration repeatedly said it was unable to bring him back, drawing the country toward the brink of a constitutional crisis when the administration failed to heed the Supreme Court's order to facilitate his return. He made his initial court appearance on Friday evening in the Middle District of Tennessee, answering, "Yes, I understand," in Spanish, when U.S. Magistrate Judge Barbara Holmes asked him if he understood the charges against him. Now remember, he's originally from El Salvador, living in the United States, not illegally, but living in Maryland. It said that he was moving people from Texas to the interior of the country. For some reason, it is Tennessee that says they absolutely, positively must be the ones allowed to try him for this horrific, horrific crime. Could he have been passing through Tennessee at the time? Sure. Was he even doing the things that they said he was doing? I don't know. You don't know. He don't know. We'll have to figure out what they say he was even doing. Judge Holmes set a hearing for June 13th. That is Friday, I think, right? Where Abrego Garcia will be arraigned on charges, and the judge will take up the government's motion to hold him in pretrial detention on the grounds that he, quote, poses a danger to the community and a serious risk of flight, unquote. Well, the only flights he's been on are the ones you force him into. So I don't know about what a flight risk he really is. But he will remain in federal custody in Tennessee pending this week's hearing. If convicted at trial, to jump forward on this, the defendant faces a maximum punishment of 10 years imprisonment for, quote, each alien he transported, said the government's motion for detention, which also contained an allegation, not included in the indictment, by the way, so it's a little odd, to say the least, that one of Abrego Garcia's co-conspirators told authorities that Abrego Garcia participated in the murder of a rival gang member's mother in El Salvador. What? Give me a break. I mean, look, even if true, this is not what the Department of Justice does with their time. If you're charging with it, say so. If you're not, then you don't make mention of it. But not this group, not this gang. Abrego Garcia's attorney, in an online press briefing, called the charges against his client an abuse of power. And even the ones that he isn't charged with, certainly an abuse of power. They'll stop at nothing at all, even some of the most preposterous charges imaginable, just to avoid admitting that they made a mistake, which is what everyone knows happened in this case, said attorney Simon Sandoval Moshenberg. You remember him. Mr. Garcia is going to be vigorously defending the charges against him, the attorney said. The decision to pursue the indictment against Abrego Garcia, ready? This is what I told you was coming, led to the abrupt departure of Ben Schrader, a high-ranking federal prosecutor in Tennessee. Sources briefed on Schrader's decision told ABC News Schrader's resignation was prompted by concerns that the case was being pursued for political reasons, the sources said. So yes, we're talking about a federal prosecutor in Tennessee, super liberal, right? Got orders, essentially, I want you to charge this guy with human trafficking and maybe even drop hints that he's a murderer. And he said, yeah, I think I'd rather resign than do that. And everybody should see it. That's what they call a noisy exit, right? You can't really comment on things for ethical reasons. Of course, you're not supposed to pretend that you have evidence that he has a murderer on his rap sheet if you don't have evidence for it, and you aren't going to charge him for it. But to hell with that, says the Department of Justice. But this guy who's not in charge and can't convince President Trump to give him a pardon has to watch his mouth. He just says, I'm resigning. Here's why. And no more detail than that. Okay. So, well, he says he thinks the case is being pursued for political reasons. Although the Trump DOJ says that's good reason. That's the reason we want. That's the reason I'm ordering the rest of the Department of Justice to pursue. Do it for political reasons. And also let's investigate the politicization of the DOJ by Biden. Schrader, who spent 15 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Nashville and was most recently the chief of the criminal division, he's not just a high-ranking guy, he's the chief, declined to comment when contacted by ABC News because he can't blab about it too much. The alleged conspiracy is said to have spanned nearly a decade and involved the domestic transport of thousands of non-citizens from Mexico and Central America, including some children, in exchange for thousands of dollars, according to the indictment. You see what they're doing here? I had to add a few words into that little paragraph. What it actually says is the alleged conspiracy spanned nearly a decade. And so they did say alleged, and I guess they think their bases are covered, but if you're being realistic about it, the alleged conspiracy is said to have spanned nearly a decade. We don't know if there was a conspiracy. We don't know whether it spanned a decade or not, but this is what they're saying. And of course, they throw in there, remember, he's transporting, it is said, alleged, domestic transportation of thousands of non-citizens. From Mexico, no, that's not domestic transport. They are non-citizens that might have come from Mexico and Central America, but he picked them up in Texas, and there's nothing usually illegal about driving from Texas to Tennessee, despite the fact that that's not really a drive you ever want to make for any reason. But anyway, and then they throw in there, including some children. Well, yeah, I mean, migrants sometimes include children, but now this is meant to be like, wink, wink. We said these were trafficking charges, right? And they involve children. Well, is it sexual trafficking? No, it's just driving in traffic with them. Basically, it's Ubering them from Texas to Tennessee. Driving a Greyhound bus. Oh, including children. What? There were children on that bus? Oh, my God. Yes. As it turns out, there were. Now, Abrego Garcia is alleged to have participated in more than 100 such trips. 100! He drove to 100 places! Well, it's the nature of the trip that is alleged that causes the problem. This is all according to the indictment. Now, among those allegedly transported were members of the Salvadoran gang MS-13. Sources familiar with the investigation said. Maybe yes, maybe no. Maybe they just had pineapple tattoos, and everybody knows that pineapple stands for MS-13. Abrego Garcia is the only member of the alleged conspiracy charged in the indictment. It's a conspiracy. There's dozens of people involved. But the only one we're charging is this guy, for some strange reason. Attorney General Pam Bondi, at a Friday afternoon press conference, thanked Salvadoran President Nayib Bukele for, quote, agreeing to return Abrego Garcia to the United States. But she went further than that. But let's see. First, she's thanking him. Our government presented El Salvador with an arrest warrant, and they agreed to return him to our country, Bondi said. Bondi said that if Abrego Garcia is convicted of the charges upon the completion of his sentence, he will be deported back to his home country of El Salvador, just to be mean about it. The grand jury found that over the past 9 years, Abrego Garcia has played a significant role in an alien smuggling ring, Bondi said. They found this was his full-time job, not a contractor. He was a smuggler of humans and children and women and puppies. She didn't say that part. He made over 100 trips, the grand jury found, smuggling people throughout our country. Now, the grand jury didn't find it. They agreed to let a real jury find whether or not they did. And this was the problem with Bondi's press conference, which is a whole separate story, was that everything she was saying was so conclusory that none of this would be admitted as an opening statement in court during a trial, by the way. She's just saying, yeah, and he's guilty of this, that, and the other thing. And the grand jury found this and this and this, as if they had, in fact, reached a legal conclusion about it. They're just saying, well, we agree that there's probable cause to think that a prosecutor could prove this, but they haven't yet. But our job is just to say, do we think it's reasonable for them to try to prove it? Sure, go ahead and try. But that's important. But Bondi just blows right past that. In a statement to ABC News, Abrego Garcia's attorney said that he's going to keep fighting to ensure Abrego Garcia receives a fair trial. From the beginning, this case has made one thing painfully clear. The government had the power to bring him back at any time, and instead, they chose to play games with the court and with a man's life, Sandoval Merschenberg said. We're not just fighting for Kilmar, we're fighting to ensure due process rights are protected for everyone. Although the administration is fighting to make sure that everybody has to do it individually, that you can't fight for everyone, as we discussed in an earlier. Did we discuss it? We didn't discuss it in the earlier part of the show. Wink, wink, as I discussed in a piece that I am prepared to air in my absence. Okay, even better. Well, that's confusing. That's the problem with doing these things. The problem with preparing recorded episodes from before is when I do the few live episodes still remaining, I'm not sure whether the things that we discussed in them were ever reported on the show before. But we've been over that territory, but just not in depth. But we will later on, in case you're confused by that. Okay, sorry everybody. From the beginning, this case has made one thing painfully clear: the government had the power to bring them back at any time, but they wanted to play games, right? We're not fighting just for Kilmore. We're fighting for everybody's due process rights, because tomorrow this could be any one of us if we let power go unchecked and if we ignore our Constitution. Just a little bit more here. Oh, no, there's more than I thought. Dang. Okay. Well, Abrego Garcia, background. You don't need to know all of this. We know who he is. We know where he has been over the past couple of months. We know the allegations against him of being an MS-13 member. All right, so we don't really need to read this background bit here in order to keep you up to date. There's an extensive recitation, though. Anyway, definitely something to keep an eye on as things go forward, and but we won't be able to keep an eye on it past Wednesday, unless I keep an eye on it now and play you the recording of my keeping an eye on it later next week. Does that make any sense to anybody? If so, it's time for you to log off. But don't do it before you stick around for Justice Putnam's West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. He'll straighten you out and stick to the facts, just the facts, ma'am, and then maybe some really cool commentary to boot. And I'll tell you about what he might address you after this.
Radio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Well, we'll put it this way. Gavin Newsom, governor of California, criticized Trump as a stone-cold liar after his call about the ICE invasion. And one thing we didn't get to today, there was some really amazing footage of a reporter from Australian Channel 9 News shot with rubber bullets live on the air in LA as she was covering the protests.